Unsinkable, April 14, 1912. Pan materialized on the boat deck as the band started playing, drawn across the Atlantic by a specific flavor of terror he'd been craving. The Titanic was sinking slowly, thoughtfully, with almost pedagogical precision, giving everyone aboard exactly enough time to understand what was happening, to cycle through denial and bargaining and acceptance, to realize that unsinkable was just a word, and words didn't displace water. The panic came in waves, each one richer than the last. First wave, confusion. The grinding shudder of impact had been so gentle, so civilized. Ice scattered on the well deck, passengers laughing, making snowballs, the band playing ragtime, an adventure to tell over breakfast. Pan tasted their confidence and smiled, knowing what came next. Second wave, realization. The bow was low, not alarmingly so, just noticeably. The tilt was subtle but persistent, the kind of angle that made champagne glasses slide slowly across tables. Stewards maintaining professional calm while calculating lifeboats versus passengers and coming up several hundred short. Pan watched the math spread through first class like a fever. Third wave, the lifeboats. Women and children first, such a civilized principle when you had enough boats. But they didn't, would never. The unsinkable ship needed only enough lifeboats for appearance, not for everyone. Pan savored the moment when this truth settled over the crowd like ice water. Someone was going to die, probably you, and the only question was how gracefully you'd face it. He walked among them, invisible, feeding. The millionaire realizing his money meant nothing here. The engineer understanding his ship was a corpse that didn't know it yet. The mother counting lifeboats and children and arriving at impossible arithmetic. The band kept playing. Pan appreciated that, the performance of normalcy as the stage tilted beneath their feet, as if maintaining decorum could stop physics, could negotiate with the North Atlantic, could make icebergs apologize. The water was 28 degrees. Pan knew because he could taste it in their terror. The primal understanding that even if you survived the sinking, you wouldn't survive the cold. That the ocean didn't care about your booking class or your bravery or your last words. It would stop your heart in 15 minutes, and your consciousness in 5, and your story whenever someone bothered to remember it. Fourth wave, the final plunge. The stern rising like a cathedral spire, bodies tumbling. The last lifeboat pulling away from screams. Pan stood on the tilting deck with the ones who'd stayed, who'd accepted, who'd made their peace or failed to. He tasted 1,000 different flavors of ending. Rage and resignation, prayer and profanity, dignity and despair. The ship broke in half. The lights went out. The band stopped playing. And Pan rode it down into darkness, gorging on the purest panic. The certainty of death arriving slowly enough to be understood, quickly enough to be inevitable. 1,500 souls learning that unsinkable was hubris, that icebergs don't read marketing materials, that nature intersecting with arrogance produces corpses floating in formal wear. The Titanic vanished beneath him. Pan rose to the surface, watching lifeboats drift in the darkness, listening to the screams fade as hypothermia did its work. They'd built the unsinkable ship. The ocean had barely noticed. Pan drifted back toward shore, well fed, already anticipating the investigations and the recriminations and the terror that would ripple outward for decades. If the Titanic could sink, nothing was safe. If the engineers were wrong, all certainty was conditional. If impossible became possible in one freezing night, what else might happen? The panic would last generations, exactly as he liked it. The trenches, 1916. Pan walked the Western Front, and for the first time in millennia he was overwhelmed. Not by the death. Death was still boring, mechanical, industrial. But by the panic, it was everywhere. In everything. The trenches had weaponized it, industrialized it, made it standard issue alongside the rifles and gas masks. This wasn't the sharp spike of sudden disaster. This was sustained, grinding, months-long terror that had nowhere to discharge. Soldiers lived in it, ate in it, slept in it, became it. The panic had time to evolve, to mutate, to develop flavors Pan had never tasted before. He followed a battalion through the mud at Verdun, sampling. The new recruit whose first artillery barrage taught him that bravery was irrelevant when the earth itself was exploding. His panic was fresh, clean, educational, the rapid rewriting of every assumption about warfare, heroism, and the reliability of solid ground. The veteran of 18 months whose panic had gone chronic had become his baseline, who couldn't remember what it felt like to not be terrified. His terror had texture now, had layers. Fear of shells, fear of gas, fear of rats, fear of his own mind finally accepting that this was forever, that the war would never end, because wars didn't end. They just ground you down until you were meat-fertilizing French soil. The officer trying to maintain order while his hands shook, trying to plan attacks while knowing the plan was run into machine gun fire and die, dressed up in military terminology. His panic was existential, not just fear of death, but fear that his role was theatrical, that command was performance art, that he was sending men to die for yards of mud nobody wanted. The gas came on the third day of his observation. Pan watched it roll across no man's land like fog, like something natural, and he tasted the panic spike as the soldiers understood. This wasn't bullets. Bullets you could hide from. This was air weaponized. The thing you needed to live was trying to kill you. Masks went on, but Pan could feel their terror through the rubber and glass. The filter only worked if it was clean, if it was fitted right, if the gas wasn't too concentrated, if you'd sealed it properly in the mud and chaos. Every breath was a gamble. Every inhale a prayer that the chemistry was working, that you weren't already dying, that the burning in your lungs was fear and not chlorine. A boy's mask failed. Pan watched him claw at his throat, watched his friends try to help while backing away because helping meant exposure, meant death, meant joining him in the drowning on land. The panic in that circle was perfect. The dying boy's terror pure and primal. His friend's terror more complex, flavored with guilt and survival instinct, and the knowledge that any of them could be next, because gas didn't care about friendship or bravery, or how much you wanted to help. The bombardment resumed at dawn, not targeting anything specific, just churning the earth, ensuring no one rested, no one forgot, no one mistook silence for safety. The shells came random, relentless, teaching the lesson that you could do everything right and still die. Could die because the artillery spotter had sneezed. Could die because someone 6 miles away had pulled a lanyard. Pan walked among them for weeks, gorging himself. The trenches were an all-you-can-eat buffet of terror, industrial-scale panic production. 16 hours of fear per day for months, for years, for as long as the generals and politicians needed to admit that this method of war produced nothing but corpses and psychological ruins. Shell shock, they'd call it later. But Pan knew what it really was. The human nervous system learning that safety was myth, that control was illusion, that you could do everything right and still die screaming in mud while the earth vomited metal and your friends stepped over your body to hold a line that would move 40 feet over 4 years. He left the Western Front well-fed but disturbed. The trenches had industrialized his own domain, had made panic so routine it lost its purity, became background radiation, became the water the fish swam in without noticing. For the first time since ancient days, Pan wondered if humans had learned to weaponize him, if he was feeding on them, or if they'd somehow learned to feed on each other using his tools, speaking his language, turning his ancient art into modern warfare. The thought didn't comfort him, but he'd return to the trenches anyway. The feast was too rich to abandon, even if the diners had become chefs. Even if the meal was becoming poisonous to everything it touched. Even if panic, industrialized, stopped being his domain and became humanity's baseline. The war would end eventually. The scars wouldn't. Pan would make sure of that. Hydrogen Dreams, May 6, 1937. Pan was aboard when the spark found the hydrogen, not causing it. He never needed to cause anything. Just there, drawn by the specific gravity of hubris meeting physics at 200 feet above a New Jersey airfield. The Hindenburg had crossed an ocean, had conquered distance and gravity, had made the impossible routine. Then chemistry remembered how chemistry worked. The panic was exquisite, because it happened slowly enough to be felt, quickly enough to be helpless. 37 seconds from first flame to impact. Just over half a minute for 97 people to understand that the miracle of lighter-than-air flight was contingent on the air staying lighter, and hydrogen burning was the opposite of light. Pan walked the tilting corridors, feeding on varieties of terror. The engineer who knew exactly what was happening, who'd spent years worrying about this precise scenario, who was now experiencing his nightmare in real time and learning that knowing didn't help at all. His panic had a clinical quality. He understood the chemistry, the physics, the inevitability. That made it worse. The socialite in the dining room, hand frozen mid-toast, watching fire crawl across the ceiling like it was discovering the space for the first time. Her panic was pure confusion. Things like this didn't happen to people like her in spaces like this, during routine landings after routine crossings. The crew member trying to evacuate passengers, while the floor became a wall, became a ceiling, became irrelevant as the ship folded in on itself. His panic was professional. He had a job to do, and the job was becoming physically impossible, and he didn't know how to stop having a job just because reality was dissolving. Through the windows, Pan saw the ground crew scattering, saw the mooring lines snake away as the ship became a fireball, saw cameras capturing everything because this was 1937 and humanity had learned to document its disasters in real time. Oh, the humanity, someone would say later. Pan had been waiting for that phrase without knowing it. The perfect encapsulation, not oh the tragedy or oh the disaster, but the humanity, the fundamental fragility. The meat inside the machine learning it was always meat, always mortal, always one spark away from ending. The ship hit ground. People stumbled out of the flames, miraculously alive, skin smoking. Others didn't stumble out at all. The physics was simple. Some were near exits when the ship folded, some weren't. Survival was geometry, not virtue. Pan drifted through the wreckage, savoring the aftermath panic. The survivors standing in shock, unable to process that they'd been drinking champagne 2 minutes ago and were now watching their fellow passengers burn. The onlookers who'd come to see a landing and got an execution instead. The newsreel cameras capturing it all, ensuring the panic would spread, would multiply, would haunt humanity's dreams of flight for generations. 37 seconds, 36 dead, and the death of an entire technology. The age of airships ending in fire over New Jersey, because hydrogen, it turned out, really wanted to burn and all the German engineering in the world couldn't negotiate with chemistry. Pan walked away from the smoke and screaming, well-fed. He'd learned something valuable. The panic was richest when the technology was newest, when humanity's confidence in its solutions was highest, when the gap between we've conquered this and we've conquered nothing could be measured in seconds. The future would have jets, would have rockets, would have technologies even more complex and therefore even more fragile. Pan looked forward to being there when each one learned its limits. Progress was delicious. Progress failing was exquisite. And humanity kept progressing, kept building, kept climbing higher in increasingly flammable vehicles. He'd never go hungry. The city that thought itself permanent. April 18th, 1906. Pan walked through the broken streets at dawn, savoring what the earthquake had revealed. Not the destruction. That was just physics, just geology doing what geology does when tectonic plates remember they're not actually friends. What fed him was the realization spreading through the survivors like a second tremor, this one psychological. The modern city was a myth. San Francisco had been so proud. Steel-framed buildings, electric lights, cable cars climbing hills. The New York of the West, they'd called it. Progress made permanent. Civilization that would last forever. Because they'd finally figured out how to build things properly. 47 seconds had made a liar of every architect. Pan drifted through crowds fleeing toward the ferry building, watching the panic evolve. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something more insidious, the understanding that this wasn't over. The ground had stopped shaking, but fires were starting. Gas lines ruptured, water mains broken. The city that ran on systems discovering that systems were fragile, that everything modern depended on everything else working, and nothing was working. A woman stood in her nightgown on Van Ness Avenue, staring at the spot where her house had been. Not crying, just staring. Pan recognized that look. The moment when the mind touches something it can't process. Her house hadn't collapsed or burned, it had simply moved. Was now 15 feet from its foundation, intact but impossible. A building displaced like a chess piece by a player the size of the planet. A banker stumbled past, still in his pajamas, clutching a strongbox. His bank was rubble. The strongbox was full of papers that proved ownership of properties that no longer existed in recognizable form. He didn't know this yet. Was still operating on yesterday's logic, where papers mattered and property was permanent. The fires were spreading now. Hamstrung firefighters stood watching. The quake had broken the water system. the most modern fire department on the West Coast, reduced to observers. Their training, their equipment, their expertise, all contingent on water pressure that had vanished when the pipes twisted. Pan breathed deep, tasting the particular flavor of this panic. Modernity meeting limits. These weren't medieval peasants cowering before natural disaster. These were people who'd thought they'd solved natural disaster, who'd built systems and infrastructure and codes and regulations, who'd believed engineering could make them safe. The ground had spent 47 seconds explaining otherwise. By nightfall, the fires would merge into a conflagration that would consume 490 city blocks. But the panic peak Pan fed on was now in the morning hours, as the city realized that all its modernity, all its progress, all its permanence was contingent. That beneath every steel frame and electric wire was the same old Earth, patient and powerful and completely indifferent to human concepts of civilization. 3,000 dead in the end, but hundreds of thousands learning the same lesson. The ground beneath your feet is not your friend. It's not your enemy either. It simply is. And sometimes it moves, and when it does, everything you built on top of it becomes temporary. Pan walked through the smoke and screaming, well-fed. Modernity's terror was exquisite. The panic of realizing your solutions were just suggestions, and nature wasn't listening. Halifax, December 6, 1917. Pan walked through the flattened city, feeding on confusion thick as the smoke. The explosion had been quick, too quick for terror, just physics converting two collided ships into the largest pre-atomic blast in human history. 500-600 acres of Halifax simply gone, in the seconds it took for munitions to remember they were munitions. But the panic, the real panic, came after, because nobody knew what had happened. A woman stumbled past, face lacerated by window glass that had turned into shrapnel, calling for children who were vapor. She didn't know they were vapor. Thought they might be in the rubble, might be at school, might be findable if she just kept looking. Pan tasted her hope curdling into understanding, that specific flavor of realization when the mind finally accepts what the body already knows. A man stood in what had been his street, turning in slow circles. Everything was flat, everything was burning. The harbor was on fire, water was on fire, and nothing made sense. He'd heard the collision, gone to the window to watch, and then the world had ended without explanation. That was the feast, the not knowing. Rumors spread like the fires. The Germans had invaded. This was a bomb, submarines in the harbor. Poison gas coming, run, run, run. People fled into the snow with nowhere to go, driven by pure animal instinct. That movement meant survival even when survival wasn't on the menu. Pan followed the crowd, savoring their terror. They'd learned to fear shells and gas and trenches. The war had taught them that, but this was their own ships, their own harbor, their own city becoming instant history through accident and incompetence. No enemy to fight, no enemy to blame, just chaos. A soldier tried to organize evacuations, but his authority evaporated when someone asked, "Evacuate to where?" The blast had been so large, so complete, that comprehension failed. If the harbor could vanish, if 600 acres could flatten, if water could burn, then what was safe? What was stable? What was real? Children wandered through the ruins, some crying, some silent, all lost. Pan noted their faces, not sad, just bewildered. Their world had contained houses and parents and breakfast and school. Now their world contained smoke and screaming and silence where neighborhoods used to be. The panic deepened as the hours passed, and no explanation emerged. Military disaster, German attack, accident? The not knowing fed the terror. Let it reproduce, let it evolve into 1,000 different fears customized to each survivor's specific breaking point. By nightfall, the rumors had achieved critical mass. Halifax was just the beginning. The Germans had a new weapon. Cities were falling all down the coast. The world was ending, and nobody was telling them because everyone was dead. Pan walked the frozen streets, gorging himself. He'd feasted on battles, on plagues, on disasters with names and causes and enemies. But this was something purer. Catastrophe so complete it broke the narrative. Terror so absolute it couldn't find purchase, because there was nothing to be terrified of just yet. 2,000 dead, 9,000 wounded, 6,000 homeless, and all of them asking the same question into the smoke and snow. What happened? Pan smiled, well-fed. The not knowing was always richer than the knowing. Panic without object was panic in its purest form. And Halifax, on this frozen December morning, was serving it fresh. Chernobyl Dawn, April 26, 1986. Pan walked through Pripyat at dawn, feeding on terror that didn't know its own name yet. The reactor had exploded 6 hours ago. The firefighters had contained what they could contain, which was nothing, because you can't contain a melting core with water hoses and Soviet courage. Now they were dying in the hospital, skin sloughing off, chromosomes shredding, cells forgetting how to be cells, but the city didn't know. Not officially, not yet. That's what made the panic so exquisite. Pan moved through streets where people were waking up, starting their Saturday, planning their day, normal routines in a city that was already dead but didn't know it. He tasted their unease. Something in the air, something wrong, something the body understood before the mind had language for it. A mother kept her children inside without knowing why. Just a feeling. The air looked strange, tasted metallic. She'd heard the explosion last night, but the radio said nothing, so it must be nothing, right? The state would tell them if there was danger. The state was arguing in Moscow about how to admit they'd lost control of an RBMK reactor, without admitting Soviet engineering could fail. Pan watched a man water his garden in the shadow of the plant. Watching the smoke still rising, the strange shimmer in the air. His dosimeter would have been screaming if he'd owned a dosimeter. But civilians didn't own dosimeters, because civilians didn't need to know about things like Roentgens and becquerels. Ignorance as policy, fear as treason, panic as enemy of the state. At the hospital, the firefighters were learning what radiation poisoning looked like from the inside. Their panic was clinical, medical, inevitable. Cells dying faster than they could replace them, blood that couldn't clot, skin that couldn't heal. They'd run into the burning reactor without protective gear, because no one had told them the fire was different, that this smoke was special, that bravery meant nothing against atoms coming apart. Some were already dead but still breathing, would be for days. The doctors didn't know what to do. Radiation poisoning on this scale didn't have a treatment protocol because it wasn't supposed to be possible. Not in a properly run Soviet facility. Not with proper procedures and proper training and proper everything. The dosimeters they did have were maxing out, breaking, giving readings so high the doctors thought they were malfunctioning. Surely the instruments were broken. Surely the numbers were wrong. Surely this couldn't be happening. Pan tasted their doubt curdling into understanding. By noon, buses would arrive to evacuate the city. Temporarily, they'd say? 3 days, maybe. Pripyat would never be inhabited again. But right now, in the pregnant silence of Saturday morning, the city existed in liminal space, dead but not buried, doomed but not informed, poisoned but not panicking, because panic requires information, and information was being managed. This was Pan's new favorite flavor, institutional denial creating a pocket of false calm while invisible death saturated the air. The terror was there, subliminal, pre-verbal, cellular. Bodies knowing what minds refused to accept. He walked past the amusement park, built for May Day celebrations that would never happen. The Ferris wheel still, the bumper cars silent, waiting for children who were being poisoned by the breeze. A liquidator arrived from Kyiv, orders in hand, hazmat suit on, dosimeter clicking like a furious insect. His panic was immediate and professional. He understood the numbers, understood what they meant, understood that everyone he'd passed on his way to the plant was already contaminated. He also understood that mentioning this would be counter-revolutionary. So he said nothing, put on his suit, joined the crews shoveling graphite off the roof, buying humanity 45 seconds at a time, before the radiation dose became lethal. Heroes, they'd call them later, and they were. But Pan knew the truth beneath the heroism. They were terrified. The sun rose fully over Pripyat. A beautiful morning, birds singing, children playing in parks. Normal Saturday routines in a city that was now the most contaminated place on Earth. Pan fed on the dissonance, the gap between what was and what people knew. By Monday, the truth would be undeniable. The evacuation's complete, the zone empty. But for these hours, Pripyat existed in perfect liminal terror. Knowing and not knowing, safe and doomed, alive and already dead. Pan had waited millennia for fear this pure, invisible, inescapable institutional. The reactor burned, the city woke. And between those two facts, panic bloomed in silence. Exactly as he liked it.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. share to help the channel grow.